In suburban Chicago, a 58-year-old retired teacher was about to deliver the most expensive lesson of her life. What started as morning childcare took a shocking turn when her daughter-in-law called her just a babysitter. Margaret Williams wasn't your typical grandmother. For 3 years, she had provided professional-level care, known for her methodical dedication to family. When Jessica's brutal dismissal hit, Margaret had no idea she was walking into her breaking point. Her response, a meticulously calculated $50,000 childcare bill, would shatter the family's foundation and force everyone to confront what they truly valued. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Williams had always believed that love should be quiet, steady, and unconditional. Like the way she stirred oatmeal at 7:15 each morning, watching the steam rise from twin bowls decorated with cartoon unicorns. The kitchen of her small Chicago bungalow had become a sanctuary of routine, measuring out brown sugar, slicing bananas, preparing the day with the same methodical care she'd once brought to her third-grade classroom. "Grandma Maggie, can we put extra cinnamon?" Today, Lily bounced in her booster seat, her dark curls already escaping the ponytail Margaret had carefully braided an hour earlier. At 5 years old, Lily approached life like a small tornado, all energy and enthusiasm and scattered attention. Just a pinch more, Margaret smiled, adding the spice with practiced precision. Rose, Lily's twin, sat quietly beside her sister, methodically eating her breakfast while studying the craft supplies Margaret had laid out on the counter. Rose was the observer, the one who noticed when adults were tired or when conversations carried undercurrents of tension. Margaret had been caring for the twins every weekday for 3 years now, ever since Jessica had returned to work after her maternity leave. What had started as temporary help had evolved into something Margaret had never quite named. Was she grandmother, nanny, or something in between? The distinction had never seemed to matter until recently, when small comments and casual dismissals had begun accumulating like paper cuts. "What are we making today?" Rose asked softly, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Autumn leaf collages," Margaret explained, pulling out construction paper and bottles of glue. "We'll use the leaves we collected yesterday from the backyard." For the next hour, the kitchen table became a landscape of creativity. Margaret guided small fingers as they arranged oak and maple leaves into patterns, teaching them about colors and textures and the way nature prepared for winter. She helped Lily write her name in careful block letters across the top of her paper, celebrated Rose's intricate design that showed an artist's eye for composition. This was what filled the hollow space where Thomas used to be. Her husband's death 2 years ago had left Margaret adrift in her own home, rattling around rooms that felt too large and too quiet. The twins had become her anchor, their laughter and needs giving shape to days that might otherwise have blurred together in grief and solitude. "Look, Grandma Maggie." Lily held up her collage, glue still wet, a few leaves sliding toward the bottom of the page. "It's like a rainbow." "It's beautiful, sweetheart." Margaret's voice carried the warmth she'd perfected over decades of nurturing children. First her students, then David, now these precious girls who called her Grandma Maggie and filled her days with purpose. The front door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows. Margaret's hands stilled on Rose's project as Jessica's voice carried from the entryway, sharp with frustration and exhaustion. "David, are you home?" Jessica called out, though she knew he wouldn't be. At 10:30 on a Tuesday morning, David would be deep in code at his downtown office, unaware that his carefully balanced world was about to shift. Jessica appeared in the kitchen doorway still wearing her navy blazer, her dark hair pulled back in a style that had wilted during what was clearly a difficult morning. Margaret recognized the signs, the tight line of Jessica's mouth, the way she clutched her phone like a weapon, the tension radiating from her shoulders. "Mommy!" Lily jumped down from her chair, rushing toward Jessica with glue-sticky fingers. "Look what we made." "Not now, Lily." Jessica stepped back, avoiding her daughter's embrace. Her eyes swept the kitchen, taking in the scattered craft supplies, the breakfast dishes still in the sink, the general chaos that came with creative 5-year-olds. "What is all this mess?" Margaret felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever Jessica looked at her efforts and found them lacking. "We were making leaf collages. The girls were learning about—" "They're supposed to be learning actual skills, not making messes." Jessica's voice carried an edge that made both twins go still. "Do you have any idea what my morning has been like? The Hartwell account is threatening to walk because someone on my team, completely botched the presentation. I've been in damage control mode since 6 a.m., and I come home to find you've turned my kitchen into a preschool art room." Margaret began gathering the craft supplies, her movements careful and controlled. "I can clean this up. The girls were enjoying—" "That's not the point." Jessica set her phone down with enough force to make the twins flinch. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You treat this like playtime instead of understanding that these girls need structure, need to be prepared for the real world." "They're 5 years old," Margaret said quietly, but her voice carried a steel that surprised them both. "Exactly. 5 years old and still not reading at grade level because you're too busy playing arts and crafts instead of focusing on actual education." Jessica's exhaustion was morphing into something sharper, more cutting. "I've been thinking about this for weeks now. Maybe it's time we found real childcare, professional childcare." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that hadn't quite caught yet. Margaret's hands stilled on the glue bottles she'd been capping. Professional childcare? Someone who understands child development, someone with actual training, not just. Jessica gestured vaguely at Margaret, at the kitchen, at the 3 years of daily care that had allowed Jessica to build her career without worrying about pickup times or sick days or snow days or any of the 1,000 small crises. That came with raising children. Not just what? Margaret's voice remained level, but something dangerous flickered in her gray eyes. Jessica seemed to realize she was standing at the edge of a cliff, but her frustration pushed her forward anyway. "Look, I appreciate what you do, I really do. But let's be honest about what this is. You're essentially a babysitter. A very dedicated babysitter, but that's not the same as real childcare. These girls need more than just someone to watch them while their parents work." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Lily, who filled most silences with chatter, seemed to sense that something irreversible had just happened. Rose's eyes moved between the adults, reading the tension with the precision of a child who had learned to navigate the emotional undercurrents of grown-up conversations. Margaret continued putting away the craft supplies, each movement deliberate and controlled. She had spent 32 years in classrooms, had earned her master's degree in early childhood education, had guided hundreds of children through their first steps into reading and writing and critical thinking. She had sacrificed her own retirement dreams to provide free, reliable childcare, so that Jessica could climb the corporate ladder without the constant worry that plagued most working mothers. Just a babysitter. The words settled into her chest, like shards of glass, cutting deeper with each breath. She thought of the early mornings when she arrived before the twins were awake, making breakfast and packing lunches and ensuring they started each day with love and attention. She thought of the sick days when she'd held fevered children and administered medicine and called pediatricians. She thought of the way Rose's face lit up when she mastered a new word, or how Lily's creativity bloomed under patient encouragement. "I should get back to work," Jessica said, her phone already buzzing with new crises. "Can you handle pickup from preschool, or should I arrange something else?" Margaret's voice, when it came, was steady as bedrock. "I'll handle it." Jessica grabbed her keys and disappeared toward the garage, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and the echo of words that couldn't be taken back. The twins remained frozen at the kitchen table, their autumn collages forgotten. their grandmother standing with her back to them as she stared out the window at the maple tree where they'd gathered leaves just yesterday. "Grandma Maggie?" Rose's voice was small, uncertain. "Are we in trouble?" Margaret turned, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course not, sweetheart. Why don't you girls go wash your hands and we'll read a story before lunch?" As the twins scampered toward the bathroom, Margaret remained in the kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of a morning that had started with such promise. She picked up Lily's collage, studying the bright leaves arranged with 5-year-old logic and boundless enthusiasm. The glue was already drying, preserving the moment in construction paper and autumn colors. Just a babysitter. When David arrived home that evening, he found his mother setting the table with her usual precision, each fork and knife aligned just so. The twins were in the living room, building a castle with blocks, while educational television murmured in the background. Everything appeared normal, peaceful even. But David had learned to read his mother's moods in the set of her shoulders, the careful way she moved when she was holding something in. "Mom, everything okay?" Margaret continued folding napkins, her movements mechanical. "Jessica came home early today. She was having problems at work." David loosened his tie, already sensing the undercurrent of tension. His wife had been increasingly stressed lately, the pressure of her latest promotion creating a brittle edge that seemed to cut everyone around her. She mentioned the Hartwell account was giving her trouble. Was she upset about something here? "She thinks the girls need professional childcare." Margaret's voice was neutral, but David knew her well enough to hear the hurt underneath. "She thinks I'm just a babysitter." The words hit David like a physical blow. He thought of all the mornings his mother had been here before he and Jessica left for work, all the evenings she'd stayed late when they were caught in traffic or stuck in meetings. He thought of the way the twins ran to her when they scraped their knees, the way they saved their best artwork to show Grandma Maggie first. "Mom, she didn't mean..." She meant exactly what she said. Margaret finally met his eyes, and David was startled to see something he'd never seen there before. A kind of cold fury that transformed his gentle mother into someone he didn't quite recognize. And perhaps she's right. Perhaps it's time I stopped pretending this arrangement serves anyone well. Before David could respond, Margaret walked past him toward the stairs, her footsteps measured and deliberate. She paused at the bottom step, her hand on the banister. The girls had dinner. Jessica said she'd handle bedtime herself tonight. David stood in his kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of his mother's care, art projects drying on the counter, lunch boxes washed and ready for tomorrow, a pot of soup simmering on the stove that would feed his family for the next 2 days. He thought about the delicate ecosystem they'd created, how seamlessly Margaret had woven herself into their daily lives, how much they all depended on her steady presence. Upstairs, Margaret closed her bedroom door and sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the family photos that lined her dresser. Thomas smiled back at her from their wedding day, from David's graduation, from countless holidays and celebrations that now felt like they belonged to someone else's life. In the corner of one frame, barely visible, was the edge of another photo, her teaching award from 1998, recognition for 30 years of dedicated service to children's education. Just a babysitter. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for the photo, remembering the pride in Thomas's eyes that day, the way he'd insisted on taking her out to dinner to celebrate. He'd always told her she had more strength than she realized, that she needed to stop letting people take advantage of her generous heart. The house settled around her as evening deepened, the twins' voices floating up from downstairs as Jessica attempted bedtime duty with the same efficiency she brought to marketing campaigns. Margaret could hear the subtle chaos, requests for water, negotiations about which pajamas to wear, the kind of patient management she provided without thinking. She pulled out her laptop, the one she'd bought when she retired, telling herself she'd use it to keep up with former colleagues and pursue hobbies that had been set aside during her teaching years. Instead, it had become a tool for researching children's activities and printing educational worksheets and managing the invisible labor of caring for her granddaughters. Margaret stared at the blank screen, Thomas's voice echoing in her memory. "Maggie, you've got to stop letting people walk all over you. Your time has value. Your heart has value. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The cursor blinked steadily, waiting for her to make a choice that would change everything. Outside her window, the maple tree rustled in the autumn wind, its leaves already beginning to fall, preparing for the transformation that would carry it through the coming winter. Margaret's hand trembled as she closed her bedroom door behind her, the echo of Jessica's words still reverberating through her mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. The house had finally settled into quiet, David's awkward attempts at damage control downstairs, the twins' voices fading as Jessica managed bedtime with the efficiency of someone checking items off a corporate to-do list. She sat at her small desk, the one Thomas had bought her when she retired, telling her she deserved a space of her own for all the projects she'd never had time to pursue. Instead, it had become a command center for managing her granddaughters' lives. Vaccination records, school forms, emergency contact lists, the invisible infrastructure that kept their small world running smoothly. Margaret pulled out her laptop and stared at the blank screen. Sleep felt impossible now, her mind churning with 3 years of accumulated slights and dismissals that had finally crystallized into something she could no longer ignore. Just a babysitter. The words had stripped away every gentle fiction she'd built around her role in this family. She opened a new document and began typing, her fingers finding their rhythm as the teacher in her took over. If Jessica wanted to treat this as a business transaction, Margaret would give her exactly that. Childcare services provided, September 2021, September 2024. Margaret pulled out her old calendars, the ones she'd kept meticulously updated with doctor appointments, school events, and the 1,000 small details that made up her granddaughters' lives. She began with the basics, 40 hours per week, 50 weeks per year, allowing for the family vacations when her services weren't needed. The numbers were staggering. 6,000 hours of care over 3 years. Margaret researched current childcare rates in Chicago, her teacher's instincts driving her to multiple sources, cross-referencing data until she had a comprehensive picture of what professional care actually cost. $25 per hour for experienced, degreed childcare. More for the additional services she provided: meal preparation, educational activities, transportation, emergency availability. Margaret documented it all. The early morning arrivals when Jessica had breakfast meetings, the late pickups when David worked overtime, the sick days when she'd canceled her own plans to tend fevered children. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. The breakfast routine alone, planning nutritious meals, shopping for ingredients, preparing food that accommodated Lily's texture sensitivity and Rose's mild allergies, represented hours of specialized care. Margaret calculated the cost of meal planning services, added nutritional consultation fees, factored in the grocery shopping and preparation time, educational activities. Margaret's master's degree in early childhood education hadn't been decoration. She'd designed age-appropriate learning experiences, tracked developmental milestones, created individualized approaches for each twin's learning style. Private tutoring services charged $60 per hour for less comprehensive instruction. Transportation costs. Margaret had driven the twins to school, doctor appointments, playdates, and activities, using her own car, her own gas, her own insurance. She'd been available for emergency pickups, last-minute schedule changes, the flexibility that allowed Jessica to build her career without the constant juggling that plagued most working mothers. Emergency care. Margaret had stayed overnight. When the twins had stomach flu, had rushed to the hospital when Rose broke her arm, had managed medical crises with the calm competence of someone who'd spent decades responsible for other people's children. Overnight care services charged premium rates, and Margaret had never asked for a penny. The spreadsheet grew as Margaret's memory unlocked 3 years of unpaid labor. Holiday coverage when Jessica and David wanted romantic getaways. Summer. Camp alternatives when the twins needed full-day care. The invisible emotional labor of remembering preferences, managing behavioral challenges, providing the stability that allowed two busy parents to focus on their careers. By 3 a.m., Margaret sat staring at a number that made her stomach clench, $47,382. She added professional development costs, the child safety courses she'd taken, the CPR certification she maintained, the educational materials she'd purchased, with her own money. The total crossed $50,000. The front door opened quietly, and Margaret heard David's footsteps on the stairs. He'd probably been driving around, the way he did when family tensions overwhelmed his conflict avoidance. Strategies. She saved the document and closed the laptop, but sleep remained elusive. Margaret padded to her window and looked out at the maple tree in the backyard, its leaves now scattered across the lawn like the remnants of yesterday's craft project. She thought about Thomas, about the conversations they'd had in the months before his death, when he'd begun to worry about her tendency to disappear into other people's needs. "You've got to stop making yourself so small, Maggie," he'd said during one of their last coherent conversations. "You matter. Your time matters. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." At dawn, Margaret heard the familiar sounds of her morning routine beginning without her. David fumbling with coffee preparation, Jessica's sharp voice organizing the twins' school day with military precision. She lay in bed, listening to the chaos that had been her responsibility for 3 years, noting every inefficiency, every moment of friction that her presence had smoothed away. The doorbell rang at 7:30, and Margaret smiled for the first time in 12 hours. "Elena." Thompson's voice carried up the stairs, her usual call for their morning walk. Margaret had forgotten, but Elena never did. Margaret dressed quickly and met her friend at the front door, noting Elena's concerned expression as she took in Margaret's appearance. "Rough night?" Elena asked as they began their usual route around the neighborhood. "Jessica thinks I'm just a babysitter." The words came out flat, matter of fact, but Elena stopped walking. "She said that?" Margaret nodded, and Elena's face transformed into something Margaret rarely saw, pure fury on someone else's behalf. "That ungrateful little—" Elena caught herself, then shook her head. "Maggie, you've been running that household for 3 years. You've given up your retirement, your freedom, your own interests to make their lives possible." "I know what I've done," Margaret said quietly. "Now I know what it's worth." She told Elena about the spreadsheet, about the $50,000 in unpaid services, about the decision that had crystallized in the dark hours before dawn. Elena listened without interruption, her nurse's training making her comfortable with difficult conversations. "Are you sure about this?" Elena asked finally. "Once you present that bill, there's no going back." Margaret thought about the twins' faces yesterday, their confusion when adult tensions invaded their safe space. She thought about Jessica's dismissive gesture, the way she'd reduced 3 years of love and labor to mere babysitting. She thought about Thomas's voice, encouraging her to stop making herself small. "I'm sure," Margaret said, and meant it. Margaret spent the morning in careful preparation, moving through her house with the quiet purpose of someone who had made an irreversible decision. She printed the invoice on crisp white paper, the numbers stark and professional in Times New Roman font, $50,342. She slipped it into a manila envelope alongside supporting documentation, Childcare, rate comparisons, a detailed breakdown of services provided, and a professional summary of her qualifications. The twins would arrive at 3:15, the same time they had every weekday for 36 months. Margaret prepared their usual after-school snack, apple slices with peanut butter, arranged on plates decorated with smiling cartoon animals. She set out coloring books and crayons on the kitchen table, creating the calm, nurturing environment that had become second nature to her. At exactly 3:20, Margaret heard the familiar sound of Jessica's car in the driveway. Through the window, she watched her daughter-in-law check her phone one last time before getting out, already mentally transitioning from work mode to the brief window of time she allocated for child pickup. "Hi, Grandma Maggie," Lily burst, through the front door like a small hurricane, her backpack sliding off one shoulder as she launched herself toward Margaret's waiting arms. Rose followed more quietly, offering a shy smile and the careful hug that was her way of showing affection. "How was school today?" Margaret asked, kneeling to their level with practiced ease. "We learned about butterflies," Lily announced, already reaching for her coloring book. "Did you know they taste with their feet?" "Mrs. Peterson said we're going to plant a garden next month," Rose added softly, settling into her usual chair at the kitchen table. Jessica appeared in the doorway, still carrying the tension of her workday in the set of her shoulders. She glanced at the domestic scene, the carefully prepared snack, the educational activity, the way her daughters had immediately settled into the routine Margaret had created for them. "Girls, we need to leave in 10 minutes, Jessica announced, checking her watch. "I have a conference call at 4. Margaret nodded and moved to the counter where the manila envelope waited. Her hands were steady as she picked it up. 3 years of invisible labor reduced to documentation that could no longer be dismissed or taken for granted. "Jessica, I have something for you." The formal tone made Jessica look up from her phone. Margaret extended the envelope with the same professional courtesy she'd once used to distribute report cards to concerned parents. "What's this?" Jessica asked, accepting the envelope with obvious confusion. "A summary of services provided." Margaret's voice remained calm, controlled. "I thought you might find it helpful as you search for professional childcare." Jessica opened the envelope and pulled out the invoice. Margaret watched her face change as she processed the numbers, confusion giving way to shock transforming into something that might have been anger or disbelief. This is $50,000. Jessica's voice was barely above a whisper. $50,342, Margaret corrected gently. "That's the fair market value for the childcare services I've provided over the past 3 years. I've included rate comparisons from licensed facilities in our area, as well as documentation of the specialized services I've offered." Jessica stared at the papers in her hands as if they were written in a foreign language. "You can't be serious." "I'm entirely serious." Margaret pulled out a chair and sat down across from her daughter-in-law, her posture professional and composed. "You mentioned yesterday that you were looking for professional childcare. I thought you should understand exactly what that means in terms of cost and value. This is..." Jessica's face was flushing red, her composure cracking. "This is insane. Your family. You can't just present me with a bill like I'm some kind of client." Margaret's expression didn't change. "According to you, I'm just a babysitter. Babysitters charge for their services." "Mommy?" Rose's quiet voice cut through the tension. Both women turned to see the twins watching them with wide, uncertain eyes. Lily had stopped coloring mid-flower, her crayon frozen in her small hand. "It's fine, sweetheart," Jessica said automatically, but her voice carried an edge that made both girls shrink back slightly. She turned back to Margaret, lowering her voice but not her intensity. "You're being petty and manipulative. This is emotional blackmail. This is documentation." Margaret's teacher voice emerged, the same tone she'd used to discuss difficult students with defensive parents. 3 years of full-time childcare, educational programming, meal preparation, transportation services, emergency coverage, and specialized attention to each child's individual needs. If you prefer to hire professionals going forward, this gives you a realistic expectation of the associated costs. Jessica flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the detailed breakdown. Margaret had itemized everything: the hours spent potty training, the emergency room visits, the careful management of dietary restrictions and behavioral challenges. Each service was cross-referenced with current market rates, creating an undeniable picture of value that had been provided without compensation or appreciation. "You're trying to make me feel guilty," Jessica accused, but uncertainty had crept into her voice. "I'm trying to make you understand reality." Margaret stood, moving to clear the twins' snack plates with the same methodical care she brought to every task. "You expressed dissatisfaction with my services and indicated a preference for professional care. I'm simply providing the information you'll need to make that transition." Jessica crumpled the papers in her fist, then seemed to think better of it and smoothed them out again. "This is ridiculous. You're their grandmother. You're supposed to want to help. I've been helping for 3 years. You've made it clear that my help isn't valued or adequate." Margaret's voice remained steady, but something harder flickered in her gray eyes. "Professional childcare providers don't work for free, Jessica. They don't rearrange their entire lives around someone else's schedule without compensation or appreciation. Girls, get your backpacks. We're leaving." Jessica's voice was sharp enough to make both twins flinch. They scrambled to gather their belongings, their small faces confused and worried. "Can we come back tomorrow, Grandma Maggie?" Lily asked quietly, her usual exuberance subdued by the adult tension filling the room. Margaret knelt down to hug both girls, her expression softening for the first time since Jessica had arrived. "We'll see, sweetheart." Jessica herded the twins toward the door, the invoice clutched in her free hand like evidence of some unforgivable crime. At the threshold, she turned back to Margaret. "This isn't over," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Margaret watched through the window as Jessica strapped the twins into their car seats with jerky, agitated movements. The girls' faces were pressed against the glass, looking back at the house that had been their second home for as long as they could remember. As the car pulled away, Margaret stood in her suddenly silent kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of a routine that might never resume. The coloring books lay open on the table, Lily's butterfly half finished in bright pink and purple. Margaret touched the page gently, wondering if she had just saved herself or destroyed the most important relationship in her life. The manila envelope lay forgotten on the counter, but its contents had already done their work. The invisible had been made visible, the taken for granted had been quantified, and the reckoning Margaret had set in motion could no longer be stopped. David's key turned in the lock at 6:30, the same time he'd arrived home every weekday for the past 3 years. He expected to find his usual evening tableau, his mother helping the twins with homework while something delicious simmered on the stove. Jessica upstairs changing out of her work clothes, the comfortable chaos of a family settling into evening routines. Instead, he found Margaret standing at the kitchen sink, washing dishes with mechanical precision while an untouched casserole sat cooling on the counter. The twins were nowhere to be seen, and the house carried a silence that felt charged with electricity before a storm. "Mom?" David set down his laptop bag, immediately sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure. "Where are the girls?" Jessica picked them up earlier than usual. Margaret's voice was carefully neutral as she continued scrubbing a plate that was already spotless. "She had a conference call." David noticed the manila envelope on the counter, its contents scattered beside it like evidence from a crime scene. He picked up the top sheet and felt his stomach drop as he processed the numbers. $50,000, professional childcare services, his mother's precise handwriting documenting 3 years of unpaid labor. "Jesus, Mom, what is this?" Margaret turned off the water and dried her hands with the same methodical care she'd brought to every task for as long as David could remember. "It's exactly what it appears to be, a bill for services rendered." You can't be serious. David's voice cracked slightly, the way it had when he was 12 and caught between his parents during their rare arguments. This is family. We don't charge each other for family. According to your wife, I'm not family. I'm just a babysitter. Margaret's gray eyes met his directly, and David was startled to see something he'd never witnessed before. His gentle mother transformed into someone who wouldn't back down. Babysitters get paid, David. The front door slammed with enough force to rattle the picture frames in the hallway. Jessica's heels clicked against the hardwood floor as she stormed into the kitchen, her face flushed with anger and something that might have been panic. Did you know about this? Jessica thrust the crumpled invoice toward David, her voice pitched high with disbelief. Did you know your mother was planning to present me with a $50,000 bill? David looked between the two women, who had shaped his adult life, his wife, vibrating with outrage and exhaustion, and his mother, standing with her back straight and her chin raised in a way that reminded him suddenly of his father. Jessica, calm down. Let's talk about this. Calm down? Jessica's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. Your mother just handed me a bill for taking care of her own granddaughters. She's treating me like some kind of deadbeat client who hasn't paid her nanny. I'm treating you exactly as you've treated me, Margaret said quietly. Like someone whose services have a monetary value that you're free to accept or reject based on your satisfaction with the quality of work provided. David felt the familiar panic that came whenever the two most important women in his life were at odds. His instinct was to smooth things over, to find the middle ground that would make everyone happy. But the numbers on those pages kept swimming in his vision. 6,000 hours of care, $50,000 in value, 3 years of his mother's life given freely while he'd focused on his career and assumed everything at home would simply continue as it always had. Mom, you know we appreciate everything you do. Do I? Margaret's voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath that David had never heard before. Because yesterday Jessica made it quite clear that what I do isn't professional enough, isn't valuable enough, isn't worthy of respect or recognition. Jessica threw her hands up in frustration. I was having a bad day. I was stressed about work and I said things I didn't mean. You're being completely unreasonable. Am I? Margaret pulled out a chair and sat down, her movements deliberate and controlled. Jessica, tell me what you think I do here every day. The question seemed to catch Jessica off guard. She opened her mouth, then closed it, struggling to articulate something she'd never really examined. You watch the girls. You make sure they're safe and fed and… Jessica's voice trailed off as she realized how inadequate her description sounded. I provide comprehensive childcare services, Margaret said, her teacher voice emerging. I plan and prepare nutritionally balanced meals tailored to each child's dietary needs and preferences. I design and implement age-appropriate educational activities that support their cognitive and creative development. I manage their medical care, maintain their schedules, coordinate their social activities, and provide emotional support and behavioral guidance. David sank into a chair as his mother continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. I've canceled my own plans for 3 years to be available for your emergency meetings and unexpected travel. I've sat up all night with sick children so you could get the sleep you needed for important presentations.